Zintro is a global platform that makes it easy for companies to start a conversation with highly specialized experts, consultants, contractors, and even job candidates about potential phone consults, projects, or even employment opportunities, part-time, full-time, contractor opportunities, a little bit of everything. Specialization spans all industry sectors, disciplines, job functions, and geographies. Today's webinar, Soothing the Savage Client, How to Handle an Angry Customer, will be presented by Katy Tynan. Katy is the author of Practical Guides to Career Transitions, as well as a speaker and consultant in How Work is Evolving. She advises organizations on how to leverage the free agent workforce and integrate independent professionals with internal teams. Katy has been a part of multiple successful startup exits, including Winforia Networks, acquired by Motorola in 2003, and Thrive Networks, acquired by Staples in 2007. In 2013, Katy founded MindBridge Partners to provide strategic advice and guidance to organizations and educational institutions as they manage through business model transitions and organizational growth. Over her 20-year career in IT and operations consulting, Katy has advised hundreds of organizations on how to find practical, sustainable solutions, leveraging technology and human capital for competitive advantage. She is also the author of Survive Your Promotion, the 90-Day Success Plan for New Managers, and her most recent book, Free Agent, the Independent Professional's Roadmap to Self-Employment Success. Throughout the presentation, if you would like to ask Katy any specific questions, feel free to use the questions section of your GoToWebinar control panel. If you can't see it, click on the orange arrow on the top right corner of your screen, and a window will pop up, and you can write any questions throughout the presentation in the question section. Katy will be responding to questions after this presentation live, so stay tuned until the end. We will provide also Katy's Zintro ID, her profile link, so you can reach out to her for follow-ups. Remember, it's really easy to reach out to someone directly on Zintro, and it's completely free. So anyways, without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to our presenter, Katy Tynan.
Great. Thank you so much, Enrique, and thanks everybody for joining today. I'm really excited to talk a little bit about one of the biggest problems I think that faces experts and people working independently and people working in any kind of a consultative role, which is how do you handle a situation where a client relationship has stumbled, where things are not going well for some reason, and whether it's part of a project or whether that's a larger issue. We're going to talk about where those things come from and how to handle it and some strategies for getting back on the rails. And as Enrique said, we are going to answer questions at the end. So as you listen, go ahead and note down any questions that you have, and I'm happy to answer them because there are all kinds of scenarios that come up, and it's always good to take a look at some practical examples. So without further ado, let's hop right in and talk about today's agenda. And this is what we're going to talk about. I want to go through a little bit about the angry client intro. You know, what does an angry client look like and how does that happen? And then I want to go through really the two buckets of why angry client situations happen. And the first one is things that you control, things that you as an expert or as a consultant have the capability of controlling, which if you don't do them right or you don't pay attention to them will result in an unhappy client. And then we're going to talk about the second bucket, which is why sometimes clients are hard to deal with and how to handle those situations which are really outside of your control. So those are some really big topics that I've seen a lot through my career, and certainly I know a lot of the consultants I've worked with have talked about how some of these issues run what seems like such a promising relationship and a promising project off the rails. And then finally, we're going to talk about understanding where things might have gone wrong and how to clean up the mess, how to get things back on track. So let's start out with the angry client intro and the stages of what happens with a bad client experience. And many of you will recognize these. These are your standard stages of grieving if you've ever taken any psychology courses. And they are the stages for many, many negative situations. The first stage is always denial. You know, you're working with a client and things had started off so well and so promisingly, and you really felt like things were going to be great, and you start to sense some signs that something's wrong. You start to get some inkling that this is not going the way it should be, and your very first response is denial. This is not happening. Everything's fine. I don't need to worry about it. And then, of course, the next thing that happens is it starts going off the rails and you get mad because you have other things to do. You don't have time for this. You don't have time to deal with the situation. So then you move into the bargaining phase, which is when you say, okay, if I just do this, if I just get them this deliverable by tomorrow, everything's going to kind of be okay. And then you get depressed and you start to think you're going to lose your client. And then finally you get to acceptance and say, okay, I have to do something about this. I really need to straighten this out. And the faster you can move from that initial sort of realization that something's not right to that acceptance that really you need to change and you need to do something quickly in order to solve this problem, the better off you are. So what we're going to talk about from a strategies perspective is recognizing and reacting, which is really the very first stage, recognizing that there's a problem and understanding what that problem is, and reacting quickly and efficiently and in a positive professional way. And then the second big stage is resolving the problem and moving on, getting past the issue that's causing this client problem and causing things not to go particularly well. So we're going to talk about some strategies and some specifics around both of those. But I want to start out by saying it's hard, particularly when you work independently. If you're an independent expert, resolving these client challenges can be an issue. So let's just use a little example from a consulting firm situation. If I'm a consultant, I go into a client, I've been working on a project, and something goes wrong, that client picks up the phone and calls my boss, or they call whoever their account manager is. They don't necessarily call me. And then my account manager or my boss or the person who owns the consulting company can look at that situation and try and work it out with the client, and they have a degree of separation from the situation. They are not the person that the client is necessarily angry with. But when you are an expert, when you are an independent professional, you are the face of your company, and there isn't anyone else for your client to call. So that becomes a particular challenge, and I will talk a little bit about some strategies around that and how to work with clients when you are the person that they're struggling with. And in some ways, you know, it's easier because there's only one point of contact and you know the details, but it's also harder because it's personal. It's about you. So I want to talk a little bit later about separating yourself a little bit from some of those situations so that you can resolve these issues even when they may be about yourself. So let's move into the first bucket. It's not me, or it's not you, it's me. 5 reasons that clients get angry. So these are reasons that a client might get upset with a situation. These are common scenarios that I see where clients get frustrated working with consultants, and the problem is 100% within the consultant's capability of solving. So for you guys, this is on you. These are reasons that a client might get frustrated working with you that you can fix and control. So for all of these scenarios, when we talk about them, what's important to remember is the more proactive you can be, the more you can think about these things in advance, the less likely it is that any of these will occur. And these are some of the learning curve scenarios that a lot of experts and consultants go through when they're having some of their first engagements. So what am I talking about here? Well, first of all, kickoff timing, and I'll get into exactly what I mean by that. Communication breakdowns, that's obvious. Deliverable expectations, that disconnect between what you're going to actually do and what your client expects you to do. Bait and switch staffing, and again, this happens in small consulting, large consulting, or solo consulting situations. If a client expects that they're going to be working with a certain resource and they're not, that is what creates this situation. And then the last one, again, is pretty obvious. It's pricing surprises. No client likes to be surprised by pricing. So let's get into these in more detail, and let's get into some of the strategies for avoiding these conflicts in the first place. So kickoff timing is this bridge moment between the sales process and the delivery process. when you're in the sales process, and that's these blue circles on this slide, you have your first meeting with the client, you get to know them, you start having conversations about what you can do. These meetings are usually incredibly positive because the client is expressing what they need and you're explaining to them what you can do. And then out of that comes a proposal. And again, a proposal is generally a very positive situation where you're describing what you do and you're putting a price point on it and your client is confirming. And if you want more tips on that, you should certainly look at the webinar that we did recently where we talk about proposals that win business, because I go into a lot of detail on how to write proposals. Then you get into contract negotiations. This can be a place where some friction comes up, and I'll talk about that when we talk about the other side of the coin, what happens on the client side. But finally, if you get all the way through that process and you come out the door with a signed contract, then you go to the next step. And this is a handoff step in a company that has multiple people, but if it's just you, it's a handoff step to yourself, which is then you need to kick off the process. And what I see happen a lot of times with particularly new consultants, but also with consultants and experts who've been doing this for a long time, is their calendar's full and they're busy. So they're working to get the contract signed, and then when they go to put a time on the calendar to kick off the project, it's 3 weeks away or 4 weeks away, and your client completely freaks out. And they get angry so early in the process. So kickoff timing is something that you need to be thinking about way back in the contract negotiation and proposal stage to really lay out time in your calendar and make sure that you've got some open blocks so that you can respond quickly when that client signs their contract. Now, once you get moving with a client, you can certainly stretch out the schedule a little bit more, but that initial kickoff needs to come as quickly as possible after the signed contract, or else the client starts the project with a bad taste in their mouth. So I can't express how important it is to really focus on that first experience that that client has with you and make sure that that project gets kicked off not only in a timely way, but also in a positive way so that the client feels you still understand them and all the things that caused them to sign the contract with you in the first place still apply. So this is your first roadblock for a lot of people, is make sure that your kickoff timing happens in a timely way, and put yourself in the mindset of the customer. Ask the questions up front. When do you need this? What do you expect the timeline for this to look like? What kind of a time frame do you need? The other thing that can be a challenge in here is, of course, the feast or famine nature of consulting. So there's no way to get around that. Sometimes your schedule is super full, which is why I always suggest you block those times for new kickoffs. So let's move on to number 2, which is communication breakdown. And again, this is something you'll really get a sense for if you've been a consultant for a long time. But I just want to talk about these 4 specific issues that will make or break your communication with clients. The first one is regular communication. All clients, and if you put yourself in this mindset, you know that it's true. Everybody loves regular updates. They don't like to have to reach out and say, what's happening with this? What's happening with that? So I like to get into a regular schedule of updates, set an expectation that, every Monday morning I'm going to send you an email and tell you how things are going on this project, where we are, what's open, what's closed, what's done, what's not. Maybe it's Friday that I'm going to send you that, but I'm going to schedule some kind of routine communication where you're going to know when to expect to hear from me, and then every time you hear from me consistently, it builds trust, it builds credibility. So this is such an easy way to keep your clients on track and to keep your projects on track and to avoid that angry client situation in the first place. But I'm always surprised at how many consultants that I know who don't do this well, who don't do this regularly. So do pay attention to this. It's really low-hanging fruit, and just make sure you schedule those regular updates and then you absolutely hit the mark on them every time that you said you would do them. The second is notification of problems. I think it's hard, especially when you're a consultant, to confess to a client that something's gone wrong. And so you certainly want to go straight to your client and say, hey, something's cropped up, it's a little bit of a problem, it's going to change this one way or the other. The first way you handle that is to have some slush and some slack in your schedule and to anticipate some of these things. But if something comes up unexpectedly, it's really important to immediately notify your client what's happened. So notification of problems and making sure that everybody on the project team is in the loop is very important, again, to keep things on the rails and to build that trust with your client where they're not worried that something's going to happen and they're going to discover it. The third one here is clear communication. What do I mean by clear communication? I mean, explain things either in email or verbally with an email follow-up, but make sure that you are being concise. Make sure that your writing is understandable, especially if you're a technical expert. You may want to have somebody that you run your emails by if you're writing project updates and things like that to make sure that your communication is comprehensible, that you're not speaking in jargon because that frustrates clients. So making sure that you're keeping the lines of communication not only open with the first two of these, but also open and clear, and in a way that, as the fourth bullet notes, that you're verifying understanding, that you're following up and saying, here's where we are, here's what's happening next, are you on the same page? And really asking for that feedback. So avoiding communication breakdowns really comes to handling these regular communication updates, building trust through reliably being the person who communicates first, and communicating in a very clear and non-technical, non-jargony way. And then finally, verifying that your client really does understand and that they really are on the same page with you. Deliverable expectations. So here's what happens. First, here's what the client thinks they're buying, right? That's a nice car. Well, then you give them what you think is a beautiful car, and they think, uh-oh, it's not so beautiful. So this is an area where we find that client relations can go off the rails pretty quickly. And unfortunately, this is a place where you've put a lot of work in. So you've done a whole bunch of work. You don't think you're delivering something crappy, but your client doesn't think that what you're delivering is what they expected and what they were anticipating. So again, this is where up front, being able to provide examples, being able to provide a portfolio, having a really clear understanding within the project plan of what elements a deliverable is going to include, that's how you avoid this situation, this mismatch between what a client expects and what you can provide. And we're going to talk again, you're going to see the same picture in a minute when we talk about unreasonable clients, and you'll see why. But this particular issue is a really big sort of fundamental question of, as a consultant, what is it that you provide? How does it work? What is the actual deliverable? And how do you communicate that clearly to a client? I think many times clients really want and think that they're going to get the sun, moon, and stars and want to pay $1 for that, and that's a problem. And vice versa. I see a lot of consultants who way over-deliver because they're terrified of this happening, and then they end up having a really hard time making any money. So the better you can be clear in your proposal process about what the deliverable looks like, give examples, show a portfolio, that will really prevent this deliverable expectation mismatch. Bait and switch staffing. Again, all of these are things that are in your control to fix. So bait and switch staffing comes when maybe you're really busy and you decide to subcontract something, or maybe you are selling something that isn't a product you actually deliver. Clients get very unhappy when they think that they're going to be working with someone, and this particularly applies to consulting companies. They meet someone in the sales process. They really love that person, and then when they engage, they get somebody else that they don't feel like they know. So again, it's just important to be very, very clear in the initial conversations that you have with clients, how you're going to staff a project, who's going to be the lead, what other supporting resources are going to be available. If you're going to subcontract something, first of all, you need to be careful whether that's allowed or not in your consulting agreement that you have with the client, because in many cases you're not allowed to subcontract things. But also, if you're going to use a subcontractor, you need to make sure that that person represents themselves as part of your team and communicates just as clearly and effectively as you need them to, because that's another place where communication can fall down you may communicate beautifully, but then you bring somebody else into the conversation and that person's communication is not as clear, and then you have a problem. So bait and switch staffing is certainly something clients will be very unhappy about, and it's definitely something you can control and avoid. And then the last one here is pricing surprises. So it's common for consultants and experts to price by the hour. And that's a really nice typical way to have a straightforward pricing agreement, as long as the client understands when that hourly rate is going to kick in. So the lawyers and the legal profession is really famous for this. You know, every time you pick up the phone or send an email or anything else, suddenly you get an hour bill from your attorney. And it's not something that works very well with clients, especially clients that are price sensitive, if they just have this constant running tab. So to me, when you work with clients and you set up pricing within a contract, you need to really understand and have a conversation with clients about how they expect to pay, when they expect to pay, and what their budget looks like. You can't just go out and run up a big bill and then send out that invoice, or your client is really going to be unhappy and they're going to open that bill and they're going to think very badly about you. So avoiding surprises in the pricing and billing process is a really great way of keeping your clients happy and making sure that the lines of communication there are open as well. Now, I know it's hard to talk about pricing, and sometimes it's awkward to talk about pricing, but it is really very, very important to make sure that you have those conversations, or else you do end up in the situation where the client is saying, but I did not expect that, and the next conversation you're having is, I'm not going to pay for that. And especially when you've already done work, that's just not something that's going to work well for your own success as a consultant. So we talked about these 5 things that you can control that keep clients from being unhappy. Now I want to talk about some things you can't control and some situations where clients may be angry or may be unhappy or may make you angry or unhappy, and you need some strategies to deal with these. So the top 5 of these are unrealistic expectations, lack of a decision maker, inappropriate communication, no communication, and Mr. Delayed payments. So let's get into this list. First of all, unrealistic expectations. Guess what? It's the same picture. So unrealistic expectations happen when a client, again, expects something, but either their budget doesn't cover it or you never said you were going to deliver that in the first place, and so they come back to you and they're angry and frustrated. So the solution to this in some ways is the same, which is you need to do your best effort to set expectations. But the reason I differentiate this, and I have 2 different slides for it, even though they're the same slide, is because when a client is unrealistic, there really is nothing you can do. If they read your proposal, if they took a look at your portfolio, if you did all the things you were supposed to do to set those expectations correctly, and they still don't understand what they're getting, or they're still unhappy with the level of what they're getting, that's when you need to be careful how much time and effort you pour into trying to meet those unrealistic expectations, because otherwise you can end up spending really a lot of extra time and do work that you're not going to get paid for, or do work that you're not going to get any kind of benefit out of. So this is something you need to recognize if it's happening, and you need to cut your losses. You need to step back from that project. The second problem, and again, this you can try to address through the proposal and through the kickoff conversation, but there are some companies, I almost titled this slide Dysfunctional Companies, because it's really the same thing. There are times when you're working with an organization and they don't have somebody who can make decisions, or they struggle to make decisions. So you're trying to manage the project, you come to an inflection point where you either need to go left or go right. You take that back to your point of contact, and that person says, gosh, that's interesting. I'll go talk to some people about that, and it suddenly starts to blow up your schedule because those conversations drag on for days. You can't get consensus. There isn't anyone who can say, nope, we're going left, or yes, we can do this change order and move forward, or no, we can't. So it's pretty critical in the beginning of a project when you kick it off and in that proposal cycle to make absolutely clear that there has to be a decision maker. There has to be a person who has the authority and the capability and the budget authority to say, yes, we're doing this, or no, we're not. Otherwise, I would be very, very careful and hesitant about engaging with that organization. Inappropriate communication is the next problem, and this is when a client comes at you in a way that isn't right. And I have seen too many consultants and too many really great people allow themselves to be treated like this. And I just want to come out and say, A, you don't have to. It's not your obligation, just because you are a paid consultant, to put up with somebody behaving inappropriately towards you. So, and I've certainly had clients and points of contact that behave like this. And part of it is because nobody has ever said that's not appropriate to them, or maybe they have, but they haven't held them accountable to that. But you should be really comfortable when you encounter somebody who's acting inappropriately, who's yelling, who's using personal comments about you and saying negative things, certainly with threats, certainly with anything that makes you feel uncomfortable. You should be very comfortable halting the process and saying, this is inappropriate. I cannot continue to work with you if this is the way you're going to communicate. And you say it as professionally as possible, and you obviously don't rise to the bait in the other direction. So if someone yells at you and you know that your temptation is going to be to get angry and yell back, then you need to know that you need to call a halt to the communication before that happens. You need to be aware of what the boundaries are. And when somebody starts to get close to those boundaries, you need to put up some yellow flags and say, I'm not comfortable with this communication. I think we need to take a step back. Or, you know, I would really prefer to have this conversation with someone else because it sounds like you're a little too close to it. However you can make that into a situation where you can have a conversation that is not inappropriate is the way to go. But stand up for yourself and do not allow clients to behave this way, because it is inappropriate and it will make you unhappy. So if there's a situation where things are not going well, it's perfectly reasonable to address that as professionals. And yeah, sometimes does it get a little heated? Yeah, it does, because people feel like they're not getting something they want. But you will absolutely know, and you should absolutely know, when it crosses that boundary into being inappropriate, and that's when you need to call a halt and say, nope, this is not right, and this is not how I work, and we need to have either an appropriate communication or not at all. The other side of that coin is no communication, and I think a lot of us have experienced this, particularly in the proposal stage, but much more problematically in the actual project stage. So when you send out a proposal and someone doesn't respond, it's frustrating. When you've engaged in a project and you're trying to meet deliverable dates and you're trying to get responses from people and you get radio silence, it can throw your whole project off track. So this is a situation where you need to have multiple points of contact within an organization so that if you're getting radio silence from one person, you can try and go around to another person. But you also need to have some sort of escalation process that says, look, if I haven't heard from you guys in 2 days, 3 days, a week, whatever is required for your deadline, we're not going to make this deadline. And so this is where accountability comes in. Don't just allow no communication to pass by and assume that, oh, well, the client's going to understand then that we didn't hit this deadline because they didn't respond. You need to be proactive about your communication in saying to those clients, hey, if we don't hear from you, if I haven't gotten this information I asked for, if I don't have this thing I need, we're going to miss this target. And make sure that that is crystal clear so that you can, again, pull that out and hold your client accountable if they don't respond to that as well. This one is really hard. So you can have a great, great relationship with a client, and then they don't pay you. And you feel tense, you feel unhappy because depending on your financial situation, this can mean that, you know, you have to dip into your reserves, or that you have to put some things on credit cards, or you might even not be able to make some sort of a payment. It's very hard when the project process has to suddenly transition over into the financial and account management process. It's something that a lot of consultants struggle with if they are solo consultants, because they have to have that conversation on the business side as well as on the client side. So again, what I recommend here is do not let missing or delayed payments just slide. You should be setting really clear deadlines for payments. You should have a payment schedule. This goes back, it's obviously the mirror image of the pricing surprises. You should be clear about what the pricing schedule is, what's required, and if a client is not meeting those deadlines, you need to stop doing the work. And that can be tough if you feel like you need this client, but really you cannot allow that to go on. You can't allow the situation where the client's not paying you and you're continuing to do work, because at that point you're working for free and you may or may not ever get paid. And the more you let that go, the more you get into the sunk time and sunk cost, you can have a really hard time recuperating that. So do make sure you stay on top of those payment moments and timelines and when they're supposed to happen, and make sure that you get those payments as specified. And if you don't, make sure that you communicate about that. If there's a reason they're holding a payment, then you need to clarify that so that you can fix whatever that problem is so that you can move forward. So what should you do? We've talked about a lot of scenarios. We've talked about a lot of ideas. Now let's talk about the practical steps. When something goes wrong on either side of the fence, what do you do? Well, step one is you've got to gather all the facts. You can't have a conversation about what's happening based on the emotions and the feelings and the things that people are upset about. You really need to have the facts. So what did the proposal say? And what happened? What does the communication trail look like? Who said what? So to do that, you need to look at your own records. You need to reach out to the client and say, hey, we seem to have a communication disconnect on XYZ, and I'm looking for information and understanding about that and get from them what they think. And then you need to contact any third parties, any other vendors, any other people, and just get a sense for what were the expectations, where might this have broken down. So your first step is always to gather all those pieces, those data points together and put them in one place. And then you need to analyze it. So what happened and what things happened that were inside of my control? Where could I have set expectations better? Where could I have communicated better? And what are the things that are outside of my control? So did I not get some piece of information that I needed? Was there a situation that the client did something? And of course it's natural to want to say, well, I did everything right and they did something wrong and the end, amen. But the reality is it's almost always 50-50. There's almost always something you could have done to smooth the situation or something the client could have done that would have made it easier. But you need to know how exactly the situation came to be, because you need to get down to steps 4 and 5. How do we resolve this? How do we not focus on the problem? How do we get out of the blame game? And how do we get into what does the client want? What's their ideal outcome? What do I want? What's my ideal outcome? And then how do I synthesize those two things together into a path forward? Because it's really not productive to just get stuck in what happened, to get stuck down in, well, you said you were going to send me an email by Tuesday and you didn't, and so now we can't make this deadline. You have to find the path forward, and the burden is on you as the consultant to figure that out and facilitate that process. That's what's ultimately actually going to turn this into a good and positive situation, is your ability to facilitate a situation from being problematic to being back on track and getting everybody where they need to be. I don't know really of anyone who's gone end-to-end on a project perfectly. There are always little bumps in the road, little unexpected things that come up. And so how you handle those is how people will judge you as a consultant and as an expert. And if you handle them smoothly and gracefully, that's great. But if you shove them under the carpet, or if you try to avoid talking about them, or if you play the blame game, then that's not going to get you very far in terms of getting referrals and future work and business. So then step 3 is make a plan. What can be fixed? How long will that take? Who's going to do it? What do you need? How much will it cost? All of those elements come together into a plan that's going to help you say, this is what we're going to do next. And really, this is what clients like. When they see a situation where something isn't quite right, they like when you can come back to them and say, here's how we're going to make it right. And maybe it's going to cost some higher amount because we ran into this unexpected problem. Okay, well now we have a change order and now we have a new schedule and this is how we're going to proceed. Or maybe you're going to say, you know what, we didn't anticipate this and we should have, so we're going to do this extra work and we're not going to charge you for it. But if you're going to do that, you need to make sure that you say that and that you get the credit for doing that. If you just, spend an all-nighter fixing a problem because you should have known about it, your client doesn't know that you did that. So you want to communicate when you're going the extra mile to make sure you resolve these issues, and so that they understand that you're prioritizing the outcome, the good outcome that the client wants. So here's the final piece of this, which is cleaning up the mess. And these are my really top 7 strategies for getting past a bad client scenario. First of all, addressing things directly. It's really hard, and sometimes, especially for those of us who are introverts as opposed to extroverts, people who have a tough time communicating, it can be hard to do. But you absolutely need to take on these issues head on. You need to go to the client and say, something's not right. Now that applies even if it's the client's fault. You need to go to them and say, here's a situation that is not working, and I want this relationship and this situation to come out positively, so we need to solve this in order to move forward. Then we need to agree on, what does that mean? What does that change? Because if you avoid having that conversation, now you and the client are operating on 2 different work plan schedules. You think one thing has to happen in order for you to do the project plus solve the problem, and the client thinks we're just doing the project. So agreeing on that changed work plan and what that means from a pricing perspective is really important. Being professional just flows through everything I talk about being a consultant. It can never be, you can never be the person who loses your cool. You can never be the person who tosses off an unprofessional remark or sends an unprofessional email. It's always going to come back to bite you. So I can't stress enough that no matter how personally frustrated you may feel, you absolutely need to be professional throughout the process. You need to keep your cool. You need to not let anything bother you in terms of what the client might say, and you need to make sure that you're communicating, especially in email, in a professional way. And you do want to get it in writing. So when you're working out and negotiating these solutions, you want to make sure that you're able to say, okay, now we've agreed on this, let's put that on paper so that we both know what we said and so that we can communicate that to the rest of the project team. And finally, finishing strong. It can be hard on your ego for some of these things to happen. You can feel like you did a bad job or people are judging you, but you're an expert and you should feel confident about your expertise, about your capabilities, and about what you bring to these projects. And even if there's a stumble, you should still feel confident about your ability to deliver a great result in the end. So just because something happens that isn't absolutely perfectly within what you thought was going to happen for the plan, finish strong and expect that the outcome can still be really positive. I think a lot of people feel like, oh, a project's ruined if something bad happens or if they have a stumble in communications or if something happens that they didn't expect. And it's not ruined. There's absolutely room in every project for a little error and a little recovery and for the whole project to still come out really, really successfully, especially if you use these strategies for getting back on track. And then finally, you want to move on. I know a lot of people who like to tell war stories and horror stories about, projects that went horribly wrong, and it's sometimes tempting to go back and say, oh, this happened and it was terrible, and to talk through those things over and over again. But it doesn't help you. You really need to move on, and you need to focus on the positives, the great things that you've done, the good work you've done, and that way it doesn't bog you down and you don't start to worry about, gosh, I don't know if I can do that project because this terrible thing happened the last time I was in a situation like that. You just don't want to have that in your mindset. It doesn't help you. So address the issue, agree on a plan, be really professional, get it in writing, and then finish it up and move on. So summing it up, these are just your final takeaways, and then we're going to get into some questions, and I'll be happy to try and answer any questions that anybody has. But here's the really key points for this. Not every engagement is going to go perfectly. You're not going to be able to put a gold star on every single engagement you have and assume that end to end it's going to be flawlessly. It's going to operate flawlessly. So sometimes it is something you can control, and you should recognize that, and you should absolutely be proactive about trying to avoid these situations when you can, when there are things that are within your control. But sometimes it's the client, and you need to stand up for yourself, and you need to make sure that you've got the ability to clearly state when something is happening that's inappropriate or that's not the way you agreed upon it. So it is your job, in addition to being the doer and the deliverer, it's also your job to advocate for yourself and to make sure that the client sticks to what they agreed to. Keep a paper trail. There are lots of verbal agreements and lots of wonderful things that happen in conversation with people. But if you didn't write it down and you didn't put it in an email and you didn't get confirmation, it might as well have never happened. So do make sure that any decisions are being documented, especially related to pricing changes and especially related to change orders. When in doubt, make sure that you write it down. Good proposals are really important. If you're not writing proposals that set you up for success, if you're not writing proposals that really set the tone for the project in terms of what the deliverable is going to look like, in terms of how the project's going to operate, then you're really leaving yourself open for these kinds of problems. So starting the conversation on the right foot starts with using a proposal that clearly articulates who's doing what, who's responsible for what, and how it's all going to work. And communication is much more important than expertise. I know a lot of people who think that they need to be super experts in order to engage in conversations with clients, and it's just not true. 80% of consulting work is having that clear communication with the client, setting expectations, making sure that they know what they're going to get and how they're going to get it. 20%, and it's the hard 20%, is bringing your expertise to the table. But you never get the chance to bring your expertise to the table effectively if you don't do the communication side of the house. And then finally, for all you NCIS fans, an apology is not a sign of weakness. I'm sorry, Leroy Jethro Gibbs, but in this circumstance, when you're having a problem with a client, when you're having a situation, it is perfectly reasonable to apologize or to take responsibility or to come forward and say, you know what, I screwed that up. I didn't do that right, and I'm going to fix it for you. So do be reasonable, do be conscious when you're the one that has done something that isn't right, and make sure that you're coming out and being honest about your part in the process. Apologizing is not the end of the world, and in fact, it goes a long way towards making a client feel like you actually care how they feel. So that's it for today's presentation on dealing with angry clients. I'd love to take your questions and see what your thoughts are on these issues.
Thank you very much for your insights, Katy. And Zintro members, feel free to contact Katy by going to her Zintro profile. It's really easy and completely free to reach out directly to her. We have several questions. So guys, please, if there is any question you would like to ask Katy, now is the time to input it in the question section of your GoToWebinar platform. So we're going to start with a question from Larry. And Larry's asking, what do you suggest when the consultant is working in the litigation environment and they must meet the deadline or jeopardize their future work reputation, and the client still cannot pay for the expert services? It's an interesting question.
That's an interesting question, and I guess my first answer is, and this is sort of a hard decision to make, sometimes you are doing work for the purpose of getting future work, and so you may either discount or you may offer to work for free. And if that's the case, that should clearly be what you're doing. But for a client to agree to work with you and pay you and then not is really completely unacceptable. Even if it jeopardizes your future work, I don't know that I want to do work for someone who doesn't pay me for the work that I do. So I think you have to weigh how important certain pieces of work are for you, and you also have to decide whether you need to be compensated for various pieces of work or whether the reason you're doing them is to get your reputation or to establish yourself in some new industry. But I absolutely don't believe, and there has been a lot of conversation about this, I think it's unacceptable for freelancers and for experts to not be paid, for companies to say, oh, I'm going to pay you for this and then not do it, or say, oh, I want 16 free examples first before I'm going to pay you for anything. That's just not acceptable behavior, and so you do need to make sure you hold your ground and you don't give too much away for free.
Thank you very much, Katie. We have another question by Evelyn. So Evelyn says, a great presentation, and she's asking for tips on how many times to follow up on non-payers. So when do I give up? I guess that's the question.
Well, on the short answer is you never give up. If somebody owes you money, you should never give up. And there are actually some very helpful strategies for this. So if you're following up with someone, they haven't paid you, if it's $1 or $10, it might not be worth your time to follow up. But if it's actual real money, then what I would do is get an attorney to draft what's called a demand letter for you. And what a demand letter is it's a fierce-looking letter that comes from an attorney that says, if you do not pay me, my attorney is going to file something. And lo and behold, a lot of people will suddenly pay you if they're worried about the idea of a lawsuit or somebody appearing on their doorstep. It's not a great thing to do because, again, you end up in a negative relationship with a client when you're threatening them, but if they're not paying you, they're sort of asking for it. So do use the levers that you have access to. The other thing to remember is small claims court. You have the complete ability to take a client into small claims court if they're not paying you, and that doesn't cost you anything. It's a mediated process in many cases, and it's something that allows you to go after the money that you're owed. Now, in order to do any of those things, you actually have to be owed the money. So you have to make sure you have a contract and an agreement that says you're going to do X work and the client's going to pay you Y amount of money, and then you have to have done that work. So if you're not getting paid, double check that you've completed the work, that the client is satisfied, that they agree with you that they got what they expected. But I don't think that you should ever give up when someone owes you money if you think that you deserve to be paid.
And I guess that's also why you want to keep that paper trail.
Yep.
So we have another question by Samuel. So he's asking, what is your position on asking for a retainer before commencing work versus not?
So that's a great question, and the retainer question is one that comes up a lot. We had it again when we were talking about pricing strategies in proposals. So it depends a lot on the type of work that you're doing. Retainers are really typical in several different industries, and if you're doing something where you're putting in a bunch of effort up front, and particularly if a client you know is going to be on a longer net term cycle, a 45 or a 60-day payment cycle, it may be completely reasonable either to ask for a retainer or to ask for a deposit against the work that you're going to do. So that way you're getting some income that allows you to do the work before you actually complete the whole project. I don't think it's reasonable for anybody to engage with an expert or a freelancer and say, okay, this is a 6-month project and you're going to bill me 100% at the end of the project, and then 60 days later I'm going to send you a check. That just isn't a cash flow process that works for anyone. So if you can, I would certainly set up either retainers or deposits in order to get some of the money up front. You're always going to need to leave an option for a client to have some percentage at the end so that they know and they feel comfortable that they're not paying you everything up front, and then all of a sudden if things aren't going well, they don't have any leverage. So it's a balance between those two things. But retainers are often appropriate, and really it's up to you and up to your client whether that's something they're comfortable with. I will say there are some companies that are really anti-retainer, and so if you go to that company and say, this is what I want, they may come back and say, we don't work that way, in which case then you have to figure out what does work if you really want to get that business.
Thank you very much, Katie. So we have another question by Michael. So Michael has a project, he signed a contract with a client, and all of a sudden the client is asking him, so he delivered, and it was successful, and the client is asking for another version of the project that is just slightly different than the original. And so he feels that he should, so the client on one side is saying it's not a big deal, it's just the same thing you gave me before, just remove A, B, and C. And on the other side, Michael is saying, hey, this is another deliverable. It should either be an attachment to the contract or a new contract. What are your thoughts on how he could handle the situation?
Yeah, that's a tough one, and it is something that I think you run into a lot. So one of the things that he needs to look at first is when the contract was written, did he do the work as work for hire, or does he retain the copyright? So if you're creating, let's say you're creating a report, and you've created this whole report, and now your client wants to use the same report but not use one segment of it. Well, if you did it as work for hire and they own it, they certainly have the right then to take that whole piece of content and remove whatever sections they don't want to have or tweak those sections and not pay you for that process because they own the end content. But if, on the other hand, the product is still your content and is copyrighted by you and they want to use a second version, I would offer them a discount because it is going to take you less time. So I would maybe go back to them and say, sure, you can do that, but it's going to be 50% of the price of the original because it's still work for me. And frankly, it's work that I did. It's for my benefit as much as it is yours, but you're still buying my product. So there are ways that you can have that conversation, but a lot of it depends on who ultimately owns the end product and how that's written into your contract.
Thank you very much, Katie. And we are close to running out of time, so I'm going to throw one more question. It's a long one, so bear with me. I think it's going to be a good summarization question. It's from Bill, and he says, look, many of my projects are not clear-cut, and I cannot use a template from previous projects to create a proposal. There are many unique factors, some of which are not known up front. How would you suggest the best way to end up with a good situation? Meaning a good proposal, communications, and a satisfied customer. Before you answer, I would suggest watching all of Katie's webinars. That will definitely be helpful.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I do suggest that you watch the webinar we did on writing good proposals because I think a lot of the answer to your question is in there. But I also want to say every client engagement is a little bit different. And there are some people, and I would include myself in this bucket, where every engagement is really unique, and I craft my proposals differently every time. And it's time-consuming, and it makes for a long sales process. So I also charge a higher rate, and I expect to charge a higher rate because I'm giving my clients a super customized product, and I'm incorporating that cost of sales into my ultimate cost of deliverable, which is something that everybody has to think about as a business person when you're selling your expertise. So if you're doing something that's templatable, that's really easy to deliver, that's really easy to propose, then you can charge less on an hourly rate or less on a project rate for those things. But you do need to make sure that you're recouping that cost of sales and that cost of proposal customization into your project costs so that you're not just eating the cost and the time and effort that you spend, and you're not going to win every proposal. So let's say it takes you 10 hours to negotiate a proposal for a substantial project, and that project ends up being 100 hours. Well, okay, that should be 10% of your project cost, except that if you're not going to win every project, it means you might do that 3 or 4 times before you ultimately get paid for it. So you just have to adjust and adapt how much you're charging to make sure that you're covering yourself for what you're doing on the initial project win side. Does that make sense?
I think it does, Katie. Bill, if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to Katie. Thank you very much for answering that question. I know that was a big one. I would like to recommend for everyone all of Katie's webinars and many others that are highly relevant to independent consultants are available on our blog. So you can go to blog.zintro.com/webinars to find both Katy's previous webinars, and in the next week you will also find the recording of this presentation, including the Q&A. So Katy, on behalf of Zintro and our over 200,000 members, thank you so much for sharing your insights. Guys, feel free to reach out to Katy by going to zintro.com/profile/Katy Tynan. This closes today's presentation. I wish you all a very nice day, and thank you for attending.